Welcome to this explainer. Right, so today we're diving into some incredibly fascinating ideas from YouTuber Tom Scralius. We're going to unpack his analysis of how the modern education system was, quite literally, meticulously designed to train compliant workers. We're looking at a perspective that really challenges the foundation of how most of us were raised, focusing on this provocative idea that school isn't just about learning facts, it's actually a rehearsal for wage slavery. I want you to ask yourself something. Why does asking for a lunch break, or agreeing to stay late on a Friday for a report that totally isn't due until Wednesday, still trigger this weird primal need for an authority figure's permission? According to Scralius, if seeking that approval still feels like survival to you today, then your schooling did exactly what it was designed to do. All right, Section 1, the origin of adult compliance. Let's get into it. We tend to beat ourselves up over workplace burnout, right? But this deep-seated adult compliance actually traces directly back to our childhood. It creates what you might call a decades-long pipeline of permission. Think about it. It trains us from age 5 to surrender our bodily autonomy to completely arbitrary schedules. You start by raising your hand just to use the bathroom in kindergarten, then you move on to strict bell schedules dictating your every move in high school, and eventually, you graduate to needing permission to take a lunch break or go to the doctor as an adult. The environment changes, but the required obedience, that remains exactly the same. Scralius grounds this whole idea in a really vivid childhood memory. He recalls being in kindergarten, literally pressing his face against a chain-link fence, just looking out at the world beyond. And that fence was the first real lesson. He realized for the first time that his natural desires to walk, to explore, to decide when to move and when to stop were entirely secondary to the system's requirements. He obviously didn't have the words for it back then, but his body understood he was being contained. Moving on to Section 2, the hidden curriculum of obedience. Now, this early containment isn't just some mere byproduct of managing large groups of rowdy kids. It's the deliberate foundation of what we can call the hidden curriculum. This curriculum didn't actually prioritize critical thinking. Instead, modern schooling refined obedience into a science. It transformed compliance into this measurable, trackable, and optimizable outcome. It is unspoken conditioning, literally designed to produce reliable, obedient workers under the cover of providing an education. To make this a bit more concrete, think back to the assignments you were given. For instance, Scralius points to a time he spent hours memorizing African capitals for a single geography test. He never visited those countries, never used the information again, but geography wasn't the point, was it? It was a rehearsal for performing pointless tasks on command without ever questioning their practical value. It was training to simply follow instructions and get the task done just because an authority figure demanded it. Section 3, the gold star syndrome. To enforce this hidden curriculum effectively, the system deployed a brilliant psychological trap: grading. Grading isn't necessarily an objective measure of intelligence. Scralius argues it's actually a brutal sorting mechanism. The compliant child who performs on command, they get the good student label, perfectly primed for corporate wage slavery. But the independent kid who questions why they have to do pointless homework, they're labeled defiant or a failure. The system elevates obedience and treats independent thought like a glitch in the machine. There's a powerful childhood experiment he recalls that proves this perfectly. He used to freeze up during tests, not because he didn't know the answers, but because the pressure of being measured against everyone else in the room just shut his mind down completely. Eventually, a teacher put him in a separate, empty room to take the same test with the same time limit. Alone, with no one to race against, he aced it every single time. He got the gold star. The material didn't change at all. The only thing they removed was the forced peer competition. It just goes to show the system heavily values ranked outperformance and high-pressure environments over actual quiet comprehension. Section 4, what they never taught you. Now, it is incredibly important to note that this analysis is not anti-learning or anti-knowledge. Kids absolutely need education to thrive. Rather, this is a critical look at what the institution deliberately omits from your training. Think about the massive disparity between what is relentlessly drilled into us, rigid schedules, asking permission, trivia, and our massive blind spots. I mean, you can graduate without ever learning how to calculate compound interest on the very student loans they encourage you to take. The system systematically starves you of the exact tools, like financial literacy and business fundamentals, that you would need to escape dependence on an employer. And according to this view, that is a design feature, not an accident. 12 years. After 12 mandatory years of sitting in a chair for 8 hours a day, the capacity to even imagine an alternative to the 40-hour work week is effectively beaten out of you. By the time you're actually old enough to question the setup, the training is already complete, and you're way too invested in the system to just walk away. Section 5, reclaiming your stolen imagination. Because the system relentlessly demands reliable, compliant outputs, something deeply human gets lost along the way. This quote from George Bernard Shaw perfectly captures the tragedy of the modern worker. Our loss of playfulness isn't just a natural symptom of aging. It's the direct result of an architecture that frames rest as laziness, daydreaming as a lack of focus, and unmonetized hobbies as childish. Work kills our full potential because it trains us to view all of our time strictly through the lens of productivity. Skrylus shares how as a kid, he would just relentlessly draw pictures during class, completely absorbed in his own little world. His teachers called it being distracted. His mother, on the other hand, recognized it as a child's natural need to not be stuck in one spot for hours on end. Reclaiming your imagination today means reconnecting with that kid. It means relearning how to be fully absorbed in a moment, doing something simply for the absolute joy of it, without worrying about whether it checks a box on a performance review. Section 6, unlearning the conditioning. So how do we actually escape this maze when the training is so deeply calcified into our adult personalities? How do we stop that knee-jerk reaction of trying to please an authority figure who doesn't even have our best interests at heart? Well, Skrylus advocates for what he calls the quiet rebellion. You don't need a loud, dramatic, public exit where you flip your desk. Instead, just initiate a mental shift. Start testing the invisible fences. Step 1, say no to just one optional meeting. Step 2, stop checking your emails at 8 p.m. Step 3, stop performing visible effort that has absolutely nothing to do with actual productivity. When Skrylus did this, he realized the catastrophic consequences he had feared his whole life, like getting fired or yelled at, never materialized. It was all just deep-seated programming, making him police himself. Next, you have to replace that conditioning with tangible autonomy by taking small, almost embarrassingly small, deliberate actions, like dedicating 15 minutes a day to learning a new skill, or spending just an hour a week on your own project. You begin to build income streams completely outside of society's arbitrary permission structures. You learn to see money as leverage for freedom, not just a survival tool to keep you chained to a desk. And as for the next generation, Skrylus suggests a pretty radical approach. Advise them to just secure C's to get by in the system and save their true excellence and energy for their genuine passions. The most profound realization of this entire explainer is this single concept right here. The system relies on us policing ourselves. The most effective form of control isn't force. It's training people to internalize the rules so thoroughly they never even try to leave. But once you stop believing the illusion, you realize the door holding you inside this maze of wage slavery was never actually locked. The fence was never real. The true power lies entirely in your own mind. We're going to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. If the barriers holding you back are really just childhood conditioning, what is stopping you from walking away to build your own life today? Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the rules you were taught to follow.
You know, when you think about a greenhouse, the entire architectural purpose of that structure is just to nurture.
Right, it's built entirely for growth.
Yeah, you control the temperature, you provide the water, you ensure the exact amount of sunlight. And it's all with this one singular, uncompromising goal, right? To help a seed grow into whatever plant it was naturally destined to become.
Exactly. Whether it's a tomato plant or a massive oak tree, the environment serves the subject.
Right. The greenhouse itself doesn't have like a vested interest in the outcome. It just facilitates the natural inherent growth of the organism inside it.
It provides the optimal conditions for natural development. The inherent potential of the seed is what dictates the final outcome, not the glass and steel of the greenhouse.
But what if we look at the institution where we spent the first 2 decades of our lives and we realize it wasn't a greenhouse at all?
That is the big question.
Yeah. I want you to think of school not as a greenhouse designed to help you organically grow into your unique potential, but as an assembly line.
An industrial mechanism.
Exactly. An industrial mechanism designed to make sure you fit perfectly into a very specific prepackaged, standardized box. So today, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are unpacking YouTuber Tom Skrylus' concept of the curriculum of obedience.
Which is such a fascinating framework.
It really is. It's this hidden architecture of the classroom designed to make you a compliant worker.
And it's a fundamental paradigm shift in how we view our own formative years. I mean, we operate under this collective cultural assumption that education is this pure, intellectually nurturing environment.
Right, like it's a noble pursuit.
Exactly. But when you examine the actual daily mechanics of it, the schedules, the physical restrictions, the reward systems, it begins to look indistinguishable from an industrial manufacturing process.
It's spooky when you really look at it.
It is. The goal, at least according to Scrylius's framework, was never simply to teach us facts or figures or even critical thinking. The primary objective was to produce predictable, compliant laborers ready to seamlessly integrate into the 9-to-5 grind.
And if you are listening to this right now, chances are you spent at least 12 years in that standard classroom.
Oh, at least.
You sat at those desks, you conditioned yourself to the sound of those bells, you took those standardized tests. And the psychological and sociological stakes of unpacking this are massive.
They're huge, because if we're operating on programming that was installed when we were 6 years old,
Right.
programming explicitly designed to make us compliant employees rather than autonomous, thriving individuals, then understanding the mechanics of that architecture is the absolute only way to dismantle it.
So we have to start by looking at the physical and temporal environment that shaped us from childhood, right? I mean, long before we ever opened a textbook.
Yes, before we can even begin to understand why adults act the way they do in the modern workplace, why we tolerate toxic management or why we suffer from burnout, we have to look at the literal architecture of containment.
Scrylius makes this incredibly visceral observation about school as a physical containment zone.
Yeah.
And it's so normalized that we don't even see it anymore.
We're completely blind to it.
Yeah. Like you drive past a playground surrounded by a massive 12-foot chain link fence, and your brain just registers, oh, that's an elementary school.
Right.
You don't think, wow, that is a high-security containment zone for small human beings.
No, of course not. But for a 5-year-old experiencing that reality, the message is immediate and it is physical. Your body belongs to the system's schedule now.
And think about the sensory and kinesthetic experience of a young child entering this system. They go from an environment of relatively free movement to one of strict, unyielding spatial control.
Almost immediately. They're subjected to rigorous schedules. They're forced to hold hands in straight, silent lines just to move from point A or point B within the building.
Oh man, the whole hallway behavior policing.
Exactly.
You have to walk on the right side, single file, no talking, hands by your sides. I remember getting in trouble for, stepping out of line.
Oh, we all did. And this spatial control moves from the playground and the hallway directly into the classroom, leading to this really profound realization that children are forced to sit in a chair for up to 8 hours a day.
Which is just wild.
It is. If you look at this from a purely biological and neurological standpoint, children are simply not built to be sedentary for that duration.
Not at all.
Their brains develop through movement, play, and physical interaction with their environment. Demanding 8 hours of immobility is an entirely unnatural imposition on a developing human body.
And Scrylius shares this deeply personal anecdote about this. He talks about drawing in class when he was young. He was this kid who would just draw constantly during lectures.
Right, just doodling to cope.
Yeah, his notebooks were covered in doodles.
Yeah.
And the teachers, predictably, saw this as active defiance. They actually called his mother in for a conference, complaining that he was constantly distracted, that he refused to look forward, that he wasn't focusing on the lesson.
Which is just the standard institutional response to a biological imperative. The system basically categorizes natural movement as a behavioral infraction.
But his mother did something amazing. She actually defended him to the administration.
That's rare.
It is. She pointed out the sheer absurdity of the environment, telling the teachers, what do you expect? He's a child being forced to sit in a hard chair for 8 hours every single day.
She correctly identified the core friction there. The drawing wasn't a distraction. It was a subconscious survival mechanism.
Right.
The child's mind and body desperately needed an outlet, some way to channel energy against that crushing, unnatural demand to remain completely immobile.
But the system is totally inflexible.
Exactly. It demands immobility, and when the child's natural biological state inevitably resists that demand, the system labels the child as the problem.
So suddenly the child is hyperactive, or the child is defiant.
Right. The 8-hour confinement itself is never questioned.
It's a brilliant way to deflect blame. The institution diagnoses the individual, rather than auditing its own structure.
always.
But the conditioning goes so much deeper than just sitting still, right?
Yeah.
It creeps into what Screlius identifies as the conditioning of basic bodily autonomy.
Yes, you don't just sit there. You have to actively seek permission to do literally anything.
It's true. You want to speak. You must raise your hand and wait to be called upon. You want to stand up to stretch. Raise your hand.
You have a fundamental, urgent biological need to empty your bladder.
Right. You have to raise your hand in front of 30 peers and wait for an authority figure to grant you permission to relieve yourself.
This is perhaps the most insidious, deeply rooted psychological conditioning of the entire experience.
It really is.
When you train a human being consistently from the time they are a toddler until they are a legal adult at 18, that they must seek explicit permission from a designated authority figure just to perform basic bodily functions.
It messes you up.
It establishes a permanent neurological baseline. You are embedding the idea that authority dictates when, where, and how an individual is allowed to exist freely in their own physical form.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second because this is where the theory kind of hits the reality of logistics.
Sure.
You have a classroom with 30 energetic 7-year-olds.
Yeah.
If they all just got up and went to the bathroom whenever they felt like it or shouted out whatever random thought came to mind, it would be absolute bedlam.
Total chaos.
Right. Nobody would learn anything.
Yeah.
So isn't some level of behavioral containment just mathematically necessary to keep chaos out of a crowded room?
The logistics of crowd control are real, absolutely. Screlius isn't arguing that children should be feral, or that collective learning doesn't require a degree of shared focus.
Okay, so then what's the issue?
The issue isn't necessarily the implementation of order in that specific chaotic moment of childhood. The psychological damage occurs because the structure is never dismantled.
But wait, even adults need rules to function in society. I mean, we stank at red lights.
Right.
We don't just walk into a restaurant and start eating off other people's plates or shouting over their conversation.
Right.
Isn't some level of behavioral containment just the price of admission for living in a cooperative, functioning society? At what point does necessary social structure cross the line into the kind of toxic psychological conditioning we were talking about here?
That is the crucial distinction right there. Stopping at a red light is a mutual, horizontal agreement for collective physical safety.
You stop so you don't die.
Exactly. You stop so you don't die and so you don't kill someone else. It's a rational social contract. Raising your hand to ask another adult if you are allowed to empty your bladder, or waiting for a bell to ring to tell you when you are permitted to eat your lunch, that is a subjugation of bodily autonomy to a vertical hierarchy.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see the difference.
One is cooperation, the other is submission. And to your point about dismantling the structure, we don't graduate high school and undergo some deprogramming seminar.
We definitely don't.
We are never explicitly told, hey, the strict rules of the classroom were just a temporary scaffolding for childhood safety, but now you are a sovereign, autonomous adult.
No, we absolutely aren't. We just trade one set of fluorescent lights for another.
Exactly. Because the system teaches us that this compliance is the natural order of the world, masking the fact that there was never any real choice in the matter. We internalize these invisible fences long after we leave the schoolyard.
That's like we just swallow the chain link fence and carry it around inside our own heads for the rest of our lives.
That's a perfect way to put it. The transition to adulthood isn't a liberation, it's merely a transfer of authority. We seamlessly transition from asking a teacher for a hall pass to asking a middle manager for a personal day to take our kid to the doctor.
Man, when you put it like that, it's depressing. The fundamental dynamic of permission remains completely intact, unquestioned, and deeply ingrained in our adult psyche.
It does. The physical architecture of the school builds the cage. But a physical cage will eventually provoke a rebellion unless you give the captive a psychological reason to want to stay inside it.
Which brings us to the bait, the reward system.
Yeah.
If you want to keep someone on the assembly line, you have to give them a reason to keep pulling the lever. Screlius talks extensively about the grading system and this desperate need to unlearn what he calls the gold star syndrome.
This is where we see obedience refine into a literal science. If we want to understand how a population is conditioned for the workforce, we have to look at the metrics by which they are measured.
Right. Homework, arbitrary deadlines, letter grade.
Exactly. These are the primary tools of this conditioning. We are taught that a grade is an objective indicator of intelligence or mastery of a subject. But in reality, within this framework, grades are primarily a sorting mechanism.
A sorting mechanism.
Yeah, they measure compliance far more accurately than they measure intellect.
Scrilius illustrates this perfectly with a story from the sources about a geography test he had to take. The assignment was to memorize all the capitals of African countries.
Classic rote memorization.
Totally. Now, he points out the obvious reality here. He has never, not once in his entire adult life, needed to use that specific information.
Unless you are a cartographer or a diplomat, you probably won't either.
Exactly. But he spent hours and hours of his childhood agonizing over index cards, drilling those names into his head just to pass a test.
Let's analyze the mechanism of that specific assignment. What was actually being tested there? It certainly wasn't his geographical prowess or his deep understanding of African geopolitical history.
It was a stress test for compliance. I mean, it's almost like military boot camp, right?
How so?
Well, when a drill sergeant makes a recruit fold a T-shirt into a perfect 6-inch square, they don't do it because perfect T-shirts win wars. They do it to break down the recruit's ego and prove that the recruit will follow an arbitrary command without hesitation.
That is a phenomenal parallel. Forcing a child to memorize entirely disconnected, functionally useless data under the threat of a failing grade is the academic equivalent of folding the 6-inch T-shirt.
It proves you'll just do it.
It proves that he would do whatever he was told, endure the cognitive load, and suppress his own natural curiosity simply because an authority figure demanded it.
And the ultimate reward for that unquestioning, exhausting labor is the grade.
The gold star.
The little hit of dopamine that tells you you were a good kid. But this goes beyond just memorizing useless facts. The way these tests are administered physically alters how we process stress and how we view our peers.
It fundamentally changes our neurochemistry.
Yeah. Scrilius shares this incredibly revealing anecdote about taking a test in a crowded room full of other students. He describes looking around, hearing the scratching of pencils, seeing everyone else writing furiously, and his mind just completely shut down.
He blanked.
He blanked entirely. And the crazy thing is, he actually knew the material, but the acute pressure of being measured against everyone else in that room simultaneously triggered a massive stress response.
He was experiencing a cortisol flood.
A cortisol flood.
Yeah. The brain interprets the highly artificial competitive environment of a timed, ranked exam as a literal threat state. When you are in a threat state, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for complex problem solving and memory retrieval, is essentially hijacked by the amygdala.
So he literally couldn't access the information.
Exactly. The system doesn't just want you to know the material, it wants to evaluate how you perform under manufactured stress. And more importantly, it wants you to know it faster and better than the person sitting next to you.
So his teachers decided to run a little experiment. They realized he was struggling in the group setting, so they took him out of that crowded room and put him in a separate room, entirely alone.
Okay.
Same exact material, same exact time limit, and he aced it every single time.
Wow.
Yeah. He got the gold star effortlessly when he was by himself. The only variable that changed was the removal of the immediate physical competition.
Which exposes a crucial vulnerability in the system's methodology. Any system inevitably optimizes for what it measures, and our education system clearly measures and values competition over actual pure learning.
By relying on bell curves and comparative grading?
Right. By doing that, the system inherently punishes cooperation. It rewards those who can compartmentalize their anxiety and outperform their peers under artificial duress.
It teaches children from a devastatingly young age that success is a zero-sum game.
It does.
The underlying math of a curved grading system dictates that if you get the A, someone else has to get the C. Your success is inherently linked to your neighbor's failure.
Which leads to a deeply unsettling realization about who we culturally consider to be the quote-unquote best students. We operate under this grand assumption that the kids with straight A's, the valedictorians, are the smartest, most brilliant, most innovative minds of their generation.
The ones who are going to change the world.
Exactly. But Scrilius fundamentally challenges this. In a system built on compliance, the best students aren't necessarily the smartest or the most creative. They are simply the most obedient.
They're the ones willing to essentially self-immolate for the metric. They sacrifice sleep, they sacrifice their mental and physical health, they abandon their own organic interests,
Yeah.
all to secure that A.
They are the individuals most susceptible to extrinsic motivation. The system actively selects for and aggressively rewards extreme self-interest wrapped in a veneer of compliance. It creates a deeply transactional logic in the developing brains of young people.
Scrilius talks about this specific archetype of student. He calls them the San-woos of the world.
The San-woos.
Yeah, these are the kids who would literally throw their best friend under the bus, sabotage a group project, or hoard study materials if it meant securing a marginally better grade for themselves on a curved test. Absolutely cutthroat. And he notes something fascinating. When adults tell him that he should have just looked out for himself in those high school situations, he realizes that the curriculum of every man for himself worked perfectly on those adults.
They are the finished product of the assembly line.
Exactly.
Because they learned early and powerfully that the gold star is the only currency that matters in the eyes of the institution. Generosity, deep collaboration, taking the time to help a struggling classmate understand a difficult concept, none of those actions yield a higher GPA.
Right. There's no metric for being a good person.
None of them result in a gold star. So those pro-social community-building traits are slowly, methodically pruned away by the system's overarching reward structure.
It's so sad.
And you mentioned earlier how it mirrors corporate environments. This is exactly the origin point of the cutthroat stack-ranking corporate cultures we see today, where employees are ranked against each other and the bottom 10% are routinely fired.
Like the old Enron model, or what you see in those hyper-competitive tech firms.
Precisely.
It's a video game. I constantly think of it like playing a massively multiplayer online role-playing game where you're just endlessly grinding for experience points.
A grind fest.
Yeah, but the points don't actually unlock anything tangible or meaningful in the real world. They don't make you a kinder person. They don't teach you emotional regulation. They don't give you financial literacy. But the players are so chemically addicted to the sound of leveling up, that tiny engineered dopamine hit of the gold star, that they completely forget to pause and ask who designed the game in the first place or why they're even playing it.
You become entirely obsessed with the metrics of the simulation rather than the reality outside of it.
Yes.
The metric replaces the meaning. And this brings us to the actual human toll of this process. What is the physiological and psychological cost of spending your most formative neuroplastic decade chasing these artificial rewards and following unquestioned instructions?
It costs us our inner world. Period.
It does.
We're moving into the erasure of imagination and creativity here. And honestly, this is the part of Scrylius's argument that hit me the absolute hardest.
It is arguably the most tragic consequence of the hidden curriculum because it represents a literal rewiring of the human brain. Scrylius draws a stark, heartbreaking contrast between the vivid, boundless imagination of childhood and the exhausted, gray reality of the adult worker.
Think about the way children exist in the world. Scrylius talks about sitting on the living room floor for hours, building these incredibly intricate Lego worlds that possessed entire economies and storylines that only made sense to him.
True world building.
Exactly. Or drawing elaborate, sprawling scenes on construction paper. Children exist entirely in the present tense. There is zero anxiety about whether building a Lego castle is productive.
Right, they aren't auditing their playtime to see if it's going to look good on a future college application.
No, they're just being.
Children possess an immense natural capacity for unstructured play, which neuroscientists will tell you is the absolute foundation of high-level creativity and cognitive flexibility.
Really, unstructured play is that important.
Absolutely. When a child is engaged in unstructured imagination, their brain's default mode network is highly active, forging new neural connections, testing hypotheticals, and building abstract conceptual models.
Wow.
But the assembly line system cannot tolerate the unpredictable nature of unstructured play. It requires structure, predictability, and above all, measurable output.
And Scrylius mentions that when he was a kid, he viewed adults as having this incredibly dry, dull humor and absolutely zero imagination.
Which is how most kids see us.
Yeah, he thought they were just these exhausted, colorless beings walking around in a daze.
Yeah.
And he says he only truly understood why they were like that when he became one himself. The system literally drained the color out of him. It siphoned off his imagination to fuel its own productivity metrics.
Let's look closely at the mechanism of that draining. It rarely happens through a single violent event of suppression. It happens through what we might describe as 1,000 small compressions. It's the slow, steady erosion of the boundaries of the imagination.
The two out there story from the sources is the perfect encapsulation of this erosion.
Oh, that story is brutal.
It really is. So Scrylius was an 8-year-old kid, and he was given what appeared to be an open-ended writing assignment. The teacher's instructions were simply write a story about anything.
Total freedom.
Right. So he taps into that childhood default mode network, and he writes this epic, sprawling sci-fi story about a spaceship traveling to the very edge of the known universe, encountering alien dimensions.
It sounds awesome.
It does. And what was the teacher's feedback? She was polite, she was gentle about it, but she told him the story was too out there.
That is a devastatingly quiet, profound lesson for an 8-year-old brain to process. The explicit spoken instruction was right about anything, but the implicit hidden curriculum rule that was instantly enforced was be creative, but only within acceptable standardized limits.
Dream big, but keep it realistic.
Exactly. Innovate, but don't disrupt. Now, we have to understand that the teacher likely wasn't acting with malice.
Right, she probably thought she was helping him.
Yes. She was simply acting as an agent of the system, preparing him for the realities of a world that does not tolerate wild, unmanageable deviation. If your imagination takes you too far outside the established parameters of the rubric, you cease to be a student exploring their potential, and you become a logistical problem that needs to be solved.
And if you keep getting told year after year, assignment after assignment, that your ideas are too out there, that they don't fit the grading rubric, eventually you just stop having those ideas.
You learn to prune your own mind.
You learn to prune your own mind to save yourself the friction, which leads to this incredible kind of terrifying physiological reality that Scrylis discusses. He discovered, as an adult navigating the corporate world, that he had developed a condition called aphantasia.
For context for the listeners, aphantasia is the neurological inability to voluntarily visualize imagery in the mind's eye.
Like you can't picture things.
Right. If you ask someone without it to close their eyes and picture a bright red apple sitting on a wooden table, they can essentially see that image in their mind. Someone with aphantasia sees nothing but darkness. They only have a conceptual, factual understanding of what an apple is, but no visual representation of it.
Right. And Scrylis remembers with absolute clarity that he possessed a vivid, highly active mind's eye when he was a child.
He used to draw constantly.
He made little movies in his head. He lived in those elaborate Lego worlds. But as he spent years navigating high school, college, and eventually the corporate world, that visual inner world went completely, terrifyingly dark.
Now, to be clear, we are not saying that working in a cubicle biologically causes a distinct neurological condition.
Right. We're not scientists making a medical claim.
No, we cannot make a direct causal biological claim. The onset of aphantasia can be linked to various factors. However, the profound metaphor here and the psychological reality it points to is staggering. The disappearance of his inner visual world maps perfectly, chronologically, onto the years he spent making himself employable.
It's the ultimate use it or lose it scenario.
Exactly.
The brain is incredibly efficient. Synaptic pruning is a real biological process where the brain eliminates neural pathways that aren't actively being used to optimize for the pathways that are necessary for survival.
Survival of the most useful pathways.
Yeah. And if your survival, your grades, your college admission, your paycheck, if all of that depends entirely on rigid compliance, analyzing spreadsheets, and following standardized workflows, the brain stops expending energy on imagination. The system actively selects against things that interfere with reliable, predictable output.
And let's look at why imagination is so dangerous to this kind of system.
Okay.
Highly creative people who maintain a robust capacity to visualize alternatives, can imagine entirely different ways of living. They can conceptualize different ways of organizing time, community, and society.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. If you can vividly imagine a world where you don't have to work 40 hours a week for someone else's profit, where you can grow your own food or build a business that operates on entirely different principles, you instantly become a less reliable, less dependent worker.
Precisely. The conditioning is designed to make the overarching economic and social structure invisible by systematically removing your cognitive ability to imagine a viable alternative to it.
That is wild.
Once you lose the capacity to picture different ways of living, the current system stops feeling like a choice you are making, and it begins to feel like the only possible reality. It feels like gravity.
That is chilling. It really is.
Yeah.
I want to pause and ask you, the person listening to this right now, in your car or at the gym or maybe sitting at your own desk, when was the last time you did something purely, entirely for the sake of doing it?
It's a hard question.
It is. When was the last time you engaged in an activity without auditing its value, without worrying if it was productive or if it was a waste of time or if it could be monetized into a side hustle? Have we been so thoroughly conditioned by the curriculum of obedience that we've forgotten how to just exist in a moment without justifying our existence through output?
It is a vital necessary question for self-reflection, because recognizing that loss of imagination pivots us perfectly into the next layer of Scrylius's argument.
Right.
Up to this point, we've spent a lot of time analyzing what the education system forcefully injects into us, the schedules, the spatial confinement, the obedience, the acceptable limits of creativity. But the argument goes further. What the system intentionally withholds from us is just as manipulated, deliberate, and crucial to the assembly line as what it provides.
The deliberate gaps.
Yeah.
The gaping holes in our education. Let's think back to that African capitals test. You graduate high school knowing the capital of Burkina Faso, you know the powerhouse of the cells, the mitochondria, you know the Pythagorean theorem.
Classic trivia.
Right. But you graduate utterly, completely lacking the most basic, fundamental survival skills required to navigate modern adult life.
The glaring contradiction here is central to understanding the true purpose of the institution. We are legally mandated to spend over a decade inside a system purportedly designed to prepare us for the realities of life. Yet, the vast, overwhelming majority of students walk across that graduation stage with zero formal education on how to calculate compound interest, how credit cards and debt traps actually function, how to build personal wealth, how to file taxes, or how to create income streams outside of traditional W-2 employment.
It's objectively insane when you step back and look at it. The very same high school guidance counselors who aggressively push you to take out a massive, non-dischargeable student loan to attend a four-year university never once sit you down to teach you how the compounding interest on that specific loan is mathematically designed to trap you in debt for the next 20 years.
And Scrylius's analysis of this reality is that this omission is not an accident of curriculum design.
It's on purpose.
It is a core feature of the architecture.
He argues that school isn't education, it's preparation. It is precision engineered to place individuals onto the conveyor belt of wage slavery at the exact right biological age, with the exact right compliant mindset, entirely dependent on a bi-weekly paycheck just to survive.
Consider what is actually taught regarding economics and labor. The system teaches you, in excruciating detail, how to give value to an established corporation.
How to be a good employee.
Exactly. It teaches you how to show up on time, how to follow a complex workflow designed by someone else, how to draft reports, and how to complete tasks that ultimately benefit the employer's bottom line. But it never, at any point, teaches you how to capture or build value for yourself.
Because financial independence is the ultimate threat to the assembly line. A financially literate, financially independent person does not need to accept poor working conditions, stagnant wages, or toxic management. If they teach you how to build your own wealth, they're essentially handing you the keys to walk out of the factory.
Exactly. Widespread financial ignorance is the grease that keeps the wheels of the economy turning. If the workforce doesn't understand money, they will trade their time for it indefinitely.
That's a perfect trap.
It is. And Scrylius touches on this deeply tragic speculation about how this cycle perpetuates itself across generations. He talks about observing his own father.
Oh, this part got me.
He watched his dad work grueling 50-hour weeks for 30 years, coming home physically and emotionally exhausted every single day, constantly complaining about the whims of his boss and his total lack of personal freedom. The system was clearly, visibly breaking his father down.
A story so many of us recognize. I mean, my dad was the same way. But the real tragedy is that because of his own conditioning, the father never aimed his frustration at the system itself. He internalized the struggle.
He blamed himself.
Right. He assumed that the reason he was exhausted and trapped was simply because he wasn't smart enough, or he hadn't worked quite hard enough, or he wasn't resilient enough.
The architecture of containment was so normalized that it became invisible to him. And because he couldn't see the systemic nature of his trap, what advice did he pass down to his son?
The ultimate cursed advice. Work hard in school, get good grades so you can get a good, secure job.
Precisely. The father, ground down by this exact paradigm, unknowingly functions as the mechanism of transmission. He teaches his child to double down on the very path that exhausted him, holding on to this desperate hope that somehow, if his son is just a little more obedient, a little better at following the rules, the system will be kinder to the next generation.
It is the tragic reality of passing down suffering disguised as practical advice.
It truly is.
Now, I know exactly what some people are thinking right now. I can hear the pushback.
Oh, for sure.
People are saying, come on, schools aren't these evil, malicious entities run by some shadowy cabal trying to enslave children. Teachers are incredibly hardworking, well-meaning people who genuinely care about kids.
And they are.
Yes, schools are just massively underfunded, overwhelmed by standardized testing mandates, and doing the best they can. So how do we reconcile the structural reality of the curriculum of obedience with the fact that most educators are good people?
It is a vital distinction to make, and it requires a mature understanding of how complex systems operate. We do not need to invent a smoky backroom conspiracy of evil elites twirling their mustaches to explain this outcome.
Right.
If you look at the history of the modern education system, it has its roots heavily in the Industrial Revolution. It was explicitly modeled on the Prussian system, which was designed to produce obedient soldiers and compliant factory workers.
Wait, really?
Yes. The ringing of the school bell to signal the change of periods was literally modeled on the factory whistle signaling shift changes.
Wow, so it's systemic evolution, not a comic book villain conspiracy.
Precisely. Systems naturally, organically evolve to optimize for the outputs that society and the broader economy reward. Currently, our macroeconomic structure massively rewards predictable, dependent, compliant laborers who will show up, do the work, and consume products.
So the schools just match that need.
Therefore, the institutions that feed that economy naturally, almost unconsciously, optimize their processes to produce that exact output. The system isn't consciously malicious, it is just ruthlessly, blindly efficient at fulfilling its historical mandate. The teachers are often just as trapped and exhausted by the system as the students are.
It's just the assembly line doing what assembly lines were built to do.
Exactly.
So we've spent 12 to 16 years on this assembly line. We've internalized the bells, the permission structures, the gold stars, the financial dependency. The rehearsal is over. We put on a cap and gown, we graduate, and the curtain rises on the actual lifelong performance, the modern workplace. Let's look at the transition from the classroom to the cubicle.
The most striking element highlighted in Scrylius's analysis of this phase is the terrifying seamlessness of the transition.
Seamlessness, yeah.
It is explicitly designed to be frictionless, because the underlying psychological structures of both environments are practically identical.
It is a one-to-one mapping. We go straight from classrooms to cubicles. We swap out homework assignments for quarterly reports. We stop answering to teachers and start answering to middle managers. The titles on the doors change, the physical location changes, but the fundamental power dynamic is precisely the same.
This doesn't change at all.
Scrylius shares this story from the sources that just perfectly captures how deeply this programming is embedded. He talks about being in his 30s, a grown, competent adult professional sitting in a corporate strategy meeting.
Okay.
He was waiting for his turn to speak about a project he was leading. And he suddenly realized, with horror, that he was physically holding himself back, actively waiting for a lull so he could raise his hand to interject.
Oh, wow.
He felt this overwhelming psychological block preventing him from just speaking his mind. He had to wait for implicit approval from the authority figure at the head of the conference table to proceed with his own thoughts.
30 years of life, decades removed from kindergarten, and the primary programming is still running the hardware. The bell rings, you change rooms, the manager speaks, you listen. The fundamental architecture of how we relate to authority, how we perceive our own right to take up space and voice opinions, was poured in concrete before we were even old enough to question the mixing of the cement.
And it triggers these deep primal fears of non-compliance. He tells another story that I think every single person listening has experienced in some form.
Let's hear it.
It's late on a Friday afternoon. Everyone is tired. He's in a status update meeting, and his manager casually asks him to stay late that Friday night to finish up a specific report. Now, the absolute kicker here is that the report in question wasn't even due until the following Wednesday.
So there's no rush.
There was absolutely zero real operational urgency.
Right. If we were operating in a rational peer-to-peer relationship between two autonomous adults, the response would be a polite, logical assertion of boundaries. Something like, no, that timeline isn't necessary. I'll complete the report on Monday morning when I return to the office.
But that's not what happens when the curriculum of obedience is running the show.
No, it isn't.
Scrylius says he felt an immediate, visceral, primal pressure to comply. His chest tightened. It was the exact identical flavor of fear, the fear of disappointing authority, the fear of losing the gold star that he felt as a child facing a stern teacher.
You reverted right back.
Totally. He didn't evaluate his manager's request logically. He reacted entirely from his childhood conditioning. He said yes. He canceled his plans. He stayed late in an empty office on a Friday night, prioritizing his boss's completely arbitrary whim over his own life, his own weekend, his own autonomy.
This incident perfectly illustrates the illusion of choice in the modern workplace. We comfort ourselves by saying we are free adults, voluntarily participating in an at-will employment contract. We can leave anytime we want. But the psychological conditioning is so profound that the system rarely needs to use explicit force or threats.
We do it to ourselves.
It trains people to meticulously police themselves. You don't need a manager physically standing over an employee's shoulder with a stopwatch anymore. The employee has internalized the manager. The panopticon is complete. The guard is inside your own head.
It's the ultimate efficiency. And the sources point out that this self-policing extends everywhere. Even when people work entirely from home, in their own houses, or when they're technically off the clock on a lunch break, they enforce the company's rules on themselves.
They absolutely do.
Think about it. You feel a pang of guilt for taking your full, legally mandated 30-minute lunch. You feel a spike of anxiety if your Slack doc goes yellow and you aren't immediately reachable, even if you're just making a sandwich in your own kitchen.
Because the hidden curriculum ensures that the version of you that questions things, the version of you that asserts boundaries, is heavily suppressed by anxiety.
Right.
A curious person, a person who pauses and asks, wait, rationally, why am I doing a Wednesday report on a Friday night? That person is significantly harder to manage.
They ask too many questions.
They require explanation, negotiation, and respect. They are harder to extract consistent, unquestioning surplus labor from. The system relies on you feeling that baseline, low-grade hum of guilt so that you constantly over-deliver just to feel a temporary sense of safety.
Okay, this is getting incredibly heavy. We've diagnosed the illness. We recognize the physical and psychological cage. We see the programming running in the background. We know we are operating on outdated, manipulative software installed by a system designed to extract our time and energy for someone else's profit.
The picture is clear.
So where is the exit? How do we actually begin the terrifying process of unlearning this? How do we escape the maze when the walls are inside our own minds? Let's talk about what Scrylius calls the quiet rebellion.
Escaping the maze does not necessarily mean you have to storm the castle, burn your corporate badge, and quit your job tomorrow with no financial safety net.
Which is a relief, honestly.
That is a romanticized idea of rebellion that often just leads to ruin. According to Scrylius, the rebellion begins much more subtly. It begins with auditing the invisible boundaries. It begins with testing the programming through the strategic, measured power of no.
He introduces this concept through what he calls his little experiment. And he admits he was terrified of the potential consequences because he was fighting decades of conditioning.
That sure was.
But he started quietly, systematically pushing back against the performative aspects of his job. He started saying no to optional performative meetings. You know, the ones, the hour-long syncs where you just sit there to look visibly busy while someone reads a PowerPoint?
The worst kind of meetings.
He stopped staying late at 5:00 p.m. just to perform dedication for the manager's walk in the floor. When the clock struck 5, he packed his bag and left. He completely, unequivocally stopped answering emails or Slack messages after hours.
He essentially stopped performing the rituals of visible effort that have absolutely nothing to do with actual measurable productivity. And the anticipation of executing this kind of boundary setting is terrifying for someone who has been heavily conditioned to crave the gold star.
Oh, yeah?
The nervous system expects punishment.
Right. He fully expected the hammer to fall. He spent the first few weeks expecting to get a calendar invite from HR, expecting to be reprimanded, put on a performance improvement plan, or maybe even fired for lack of culture fit.
Yeah.
But what was the shocking, paradigm-shifting result of his little experiment?
Nothing happened.
Absolutely nothing.
Nobody fired him. His performance review stayed exactly the same, remaining positive. The company continued to generate revenue. The sky did not fall.
The realization here is massive, and it's so empowering. Much of the frantic compliance we perform on a daily basis isn't actually required by the employer to keep our jobs.
It's not in the contract.
No. It's deeply ingrained, self-imposed programming from the school system. We are doing extra credit that nobody asked for.
The metaphor he uses here is incredibly apt and liberating. The cage door isn't locked. The door has been hanging open for years.
Wow.
We just keep rattling the bars, terrified to step out, convinced they are electrified because a teacher told us they were when we were 6 years old. We perform obedience out of sheer, unexamined habit, not out of actual contractual necessity.
So, if we realize the bars aren't electrified, how do we navigate this practically? Especially when we think about how we talk to the next generation, our own kids, who are currently sitting in those same classrooms.
It's a huge dilemma.
Scralis offers this theoretical advice on what he would tell children navigating the school system today. And it's deeply pragmatic. It's not what you'd expect from a standard anti-establishment rant. He doesn't say rebel loudly. He doesn't say scream at your teachers. And he definitely doesn't say drop out.
No, because loud, aggressive rebellion is often just another form of reactivity. It makes you a visible target, and it can burn institutional bridges that you might strategically need to cross later in life to secure resources.
Right. You still have to survive in the world.
Exactly. Instead of blind rebellion, he advocates for a philosophy of strategic navigation.
He says, do the bare minimum required to check the boxes the system demands.
Yeah.
Get C's. Pass the standardized tests. Fulfill the baseline requirements and move to the next level.
Just pass.
Just pass.
Yeah.
Do not stress over the gold star.
Yeah.
Let go of the need to be the valedictorian. And then take all of that conserved, massive intellectual energy and take your imagination and pour it into the things that actually light you up outside of that rigid structure.
It is a radical reallocation of personal resources.
Yeah.
You stop giving 110% of your soul to a system that only mathematically requires 70% to let you pass.
Exactly.
You reclaim that remaining 40% margin, and you invest it directly into your own autonomy, your own curiosity, and your own future.
I love that. It's exactly like suddenly realizing you're an actor in a play, and you look around and realize the play is terrible, the script is mind-numbing, and you hate the character you've been cast to play.
Great analogy.
But instead of throwing a tantrum, storming off the stage, screaming at the director, and ruining the show, which just gets you sued for breach of contract or blacklisted from the industry, you take a different approach. You just stop saying the lines that aren't actually in the script.
Right, no ad-libbing.
You stop ad-libbing extra emotional labor.
Yeah.
You do your exact, literal contractual blocking. You hit your marks. You say your required lines. And you take back all your mental and emotional energy for your real life offstage.
That is a perfect, actionable analogy. You fulfill the terms of the contract and absolutely nothing more. The employer buys your output for 40 hours. They do not buy your soul, your anxiety, or your weekends.
Amen to that.
And the ultimate goal of taking back that energy, of setting those boundaries, is to build something of your own entirely outside the permission structure of the curriculum of obedience.
This is how we go about reclaiming the imagination.
Exactly. And reclaiming the imagination doesn't mean you have to suddenly become a full-time bohemian artist or an instant millionaire tech entrepreneur.
Right. It doesn't have to be this massive life overhaul.
It doesn't have to be grandiose. It means dedicating time, even if it is literally just 15 minutes a day or one uninterrupted hour on a Saturday morning, to a project where you are the sole, unquestioned authority.
That sounds so freeing.
It is. It is about proving to your own nervous system through repeated action that another path exists.
You build a small side hustle. You write a terrible first draft of a novel. You learn how to code. You start a community garden. You restore an old piece of furniture. You engage in any activity where there is no boss hovering over you. There is no teacher with a red pen. There is no standardized rubric. And there is no gold star to chase except the deep intrinsic satisfaction you give yourself.
It is the active, daily antidote to aphantasia. It is the slow, deliberate process of turning the mind's eye back on. When you build for yourself without permission, you begin to rewire the neural pathways that the assembly line tried to prune away. You remember how to play.
Man, what a profound journey this has been. Let's try to synthesize what we've walked through today in this deep dive.
Let's do it.
We've explored the unsettling reality that the standard school system doesn't just impart academic education. It acts as a 12-year, highly structured rehearsal for wage slavery. We've looked closely at how it uses the spatial containment of chain-link fences and 8-hour sedentary demands to break bodily autonomy. We've examined how it uses grades and artificial competition as psychological bait to enforce unquestioning obedience.
We've traced how that system systematically stamps out the wild, unstructured imagination of childhood, favoring compliance over creativity. And we've seen how the deliberate withholding of financial literacy perfectly sets the stage for a lifetime of unquestioning, anxious corporate dependency.
Right.
The transition is seamless. The fences of the playground merely become the felt-covered walls of the cubicle.
The architecture of containment is lifelong, and it runs on autopilot unless it's consciously recognized, audited, and intentionally unlearned through the power of setting boundaries and reclaiming our time.
Which leaves us with a profound, lingering implication to consider based on everything Tom Scrylius has brought to light.
Lay it on us.
We spend the vast majority of our lives desperately trying to build a flawless resume. We strive relentlessly for those gold stars, exhausting ourselves to prove that we fit perfectly, without friction, into society's predefined mold. But if that mold was explicitly, historically designed to abstract your time, your energy, and your boundless imagination for someone else's economic benefit, what magnificent, weird, and entirely unique version of yourself did you have to quietly leave behind to make sure you fit perfectly inside it?
That is the question to sit with today. What did you trade for the gold star? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take some time this week to look closely at your own hidden curriculum, audit your boundaries, and remember, the assembly line only works if you willingly keep standing on the conveyor belt. You can just step off. We'll catch you next time.